When you think you spend a good amount of time in the world talking about the positives, that sadly immediately shifts back towards a negative. Such event as the one you're witnessing right now with the talk about Pixar and their future regarding the past and the present and the future with sequels, and in an article discussing where things have gone from wrong to correct a dire course. And yes, this title is unoriginal for me as I have discussed this many times before, but it still is as important to remember and remind us what happens when things aren't the way that they should, and what has to be done to correct course. And after I've seen a couple videos already talk about this greater problem, I figured it was time again to really discuss these issues and what it means for these animated stories in general. For someone who has felt so conflicted in his life between his love of Disney and the hatred of what has become, feeling so down if it even is worth it to continue when such many other people I've seen around me in the comments and other areas of life talk about this barrage of disappointment being churned out by these studios, that I feel truly hopeless about a future I used to grow up admiring and still continue to do so, talk about things when the world disagrees to turn its back from, to say that things like Pixar is suffering from its final nail in the coffin, to its eternal demise because that's where things are headed, but the fault of our own deception. But how talking about this should encourage us to support people to better change it from where its history does show where it clearly isn't the end of it, to be optimistically positive about these situations because I know it can succeed and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to change that future. So looking back upon a year where I talked about my fears about Pixar, it seems like they themselves are admitting such a case with the simplest remedies, ones that comes from the larger ensemble of the Mouse House itself with its push for sequels on top of sequels. Of course, not all just by Disney itself, but countless other studios where we look at the dire picture of the theatrical cinema right now and its complicated problems people keep talking about on streaming services and whatnot. Because actually looking back on our own criticisms of recent Pixar, including my own especially, we find ourselves really appreciating their recent films for still having such good quality, but not actually being released the proper way. Sure, it's not the same studio we remember from the golden age we talked many times before, but how it's the treatment of such Disney Plus has made it to affect its perception of how we consume such films, how we feel about it that dumbs it down to something we think isn't how it should be, that should match the feeling that jump-started the entire era of computer animation or compassionate storytelling that feels real through a usage of unreal elements. And how the only remedy for such events is these sequels being moved up as it has a proven track record of box office results, financially and somewhat critically both successful, but not enough for the quality of their original predecessors. Sure that this doesn't apply to all, but when you start going back to it after the end of this COVID era that shut all of this down originally and their highest peak that they ever experienced, it seems desperate or uncreative as possible to continue this path. The things that make you worried if this idea is going to work, if Inside Out 2 is going to be a good hit as many people would hope for, while pushing back to their next original film Leo the next year in order to support it after the fall of their spin-offs known as Lightyear and the struggle that Elemental did with its poor opening weekend. It's an atmosphere of confusion, not knowing where to put their heart because some people see the bigger number. You see, during the time of Iger's leadership of Disney, it's about acquiring these businesses to help supplant the organization and its creative leaderships of storytelling, but how it's backtracked in the corner of reusing the same ideas of what we already know to keep a machine going and going. Don't get me wrong, that leadership helped build the brand to its very sustainable place, but it's come to a point where it's all caving in on something that people keep getting tired of, preventing it from losing its core identity and essence of why companies do not survive for a long time over a period of 100 years at this point. Which this article does provide the interesting points of where they've been headed with the balance of originality while still pushing for sequels and the more frightening words of reboots or whatnot. This is probably an important point to talk about since we already have been in this constant phase of Disney remakes of other properties, which worries many about what that could mean for certain movies we grew up loving, about banking on this idea of this sequel that is just about to come out, where if it were to fail expectations, what does Pixar have left to offer? Is it over for their time of dominance in the world and the worried output of any lack of creative storytelling? That is just one of the many interesting things we've had over the past few years. This interview also dives into Chief Creative Officer Pete Docter, whom we know helmed one of the best emotional stories they've ever created, like Monsters, Up, Inside Out, and Soul, where some do doubt his leadership that lacks the quality that others John Lasseter had before to produce this studio to new heights, and of course Disney when he led that too, before allegations came out to change everything. That people missed that lack of cohesive leadership that allowed Disney to enter each era effectively. But the interesting point of where this article went for was for him talking about what he discussed, focusing less on the director's personal experience about the recent track record of films, especially Disney Plus's hindrance on them, and more of a commonality commonality of what connected to most audiences. This statement is something I and many others have talked about in the past year when we initially brought our concerns diving into what was happening at Pixar at the time, what we were feeling since Lightyear came in and crashed everything down. That was being niched down to a certain experience when you looked at films like Luca, Turning Red, or Elemental, but how those films actually did succeed because they were passionate at telling where they were from in an animated experience, and how the criticism of that was more aimed at not having the same universal golden age appeal that Pixar had with stories like Toy Story or Ratatouille in terms of that commonality, where anyone, no matter the circumstance, could connect to its themes if you get what they meant. In terms of feeling something that didn't actually say, this movie is cringy, this movie's too specific to a place, or this movie is just too generic and the love story has been written many times over again. It's the same immigrant story we've witnessed, and what is there else to say? And how we still live in this era of struggling bubble of ideas that were shafted by leadership changes in the past of Disney itself, with Chapek in knowing what was right or wrong, in trying to turn out where does this movie go or where does that movie go. But in realizing such words, in the past few years of the Disney Plus era Pixar films were actually quite good or brilliant in some cases, just like how Elemental managed to pull off a small comeback when people realized the true heart of where the stories lied instead of shafting expectations that Disney had put upon it, or we did ourselves, to be honest. That even if we see Luca focus on the small village in Italy about the director's childhood there, or dealing with the pre-teen's cringy experiences with her mother in Toronto, Canada, and the immigrant searching for a better life in New York, it still does not feed the bottom line that most shareholders are expecting on a daily basis that the will of the audiences could see. We do say we are tired of it all, but that's not really the truth when the opposite shows up and people keep coming back to see what's in store until it finally comes. That if such ideas exist, why wouldn't we go for it? But the problem isn't the fact that these sequels actually exist, we know there's tons of it, but more of how it's the main solution. A short-handed solution to a problem that becomes a new problem itself because it's mixing an idea back and forth between passionate edge or a specific spice or experience they actually had that translates back with the early stories as well, and the demands of expectations of needing to release a movie to appease audiences year after year to support the bottom line. When you revisit the past with those three ideas of the movies, it actually matches what the others were like in what those stories specifically focusing on, where the real modern issue just fed into the idea of not to shift the blame on Disney Plus alone, that this streaming service they went all in wasn't the problem and it was something else that the studio was doing. The difference between wanting something and needing something to succeed coming from different places of where an idea ends up. You don't rush into that unless you can provide good context for its existence, which doesn't seem like a concrete idea if you switch an original for a sequel or mention the word reboot. And when you look back on the past, there has been nothing but original films for Pixar. There hasn't been a sequel since, of course, now with Inside Out 2. And that's something to note, but because that era of COVID failed them miserably, they have to move back to that in order to sustain that solution. Where the word reboot some people keep tossing around mistakenly actually just comes from the mindset of what they've been doing with films like Lightyear. That the idea of commonality that we're attaching Pete was talking about comes from this relative turn of expanding their properties rather than saying something they were going to do over again, since everything in this word gets taken way too out of context. Which is why I wanted to make this video, because now more than ever, I am just so confused out of my mind who to believe or what to even say is good or bad, when people get peppered with the same exact ideas every day from a studio or an individual person like myself who can be considered a loving shill or a hateful grifter. Like, if we actually know a person does put heart into a sequel, it can really succeed to be one of the best of all time like others have proven, but how they usually turn into expectations because not all of them tend to feel like it actually works depending on this world of a certain demand. I admit now that it's not that all sequels should generally be a bad idea, but again how it's never the answer to anything that has been offered by a short reaction to a diminishing demand. Because the reality is, in the bigger picture, is the fact of who really drives any of this moving forward to complete such a demand, being us as consumers and our own willingness to change. Sure, a vision of a company might put out the driving factor moving forward in time that could be good or bad depending on a fan's point of view, but it's the ones who make it so that allows it to take place, to influence culture that society manages to accustom itself to and share a piece of the world to them. Being specific about itself is the key identity of Pixar that translates better than what Disney or Dreamers could ever do, where it is about if you passionately take inspiration from your own life that makes them who they are, and why I think many do basically about the point that the fact that Inside Out's 2's success could lead them back to supplanting the buffering slate of original films in theaters yet again with the heart they always had, and then using Disney Plus series to act as a better support rather than full-length features, which is also another conflict that needs to be worked out to provide more content, as other ideas like Moana 2 for Disney was turned from a series into a movie that is still hurting the entire argument of who is in charge of who, the idea of conflict that is originated from, that everything is actually based on a reaction and no studio is safe from that idea no matter the cost, even if you manage to turn around a story one time. It's now the question of if we live with it, if we actually find room to live with sequels coming out time and time again, no matter how much we talk about it and the death of creative art or passion into it, that the new projects, despite what has actually been going on, demonstrates a lack of respect of any new idea or story someone can make from their own heart to tell. Or maybe some things like this are good to gauge opinions about things, to see where the uncertainty might lead to the future if this is a good strategy to rebuild trust to the next Pixar film, of course being the original of Leo. What it is going to say about us as consumers or audience if we do accept it, if this film is the right direction to tell us that things are actually where they need to be. The real point of where we must continue to question is if such pattern exists within a certain group of people. Remember, everything combines the hard work of a larger group, even if one person or another small subsection of a company deems where that direction is headed, and of course directed by a group of people known as shareholders who dictate the stupid decisions just to make money on a daily basis. Where frankly, I do have to agree with this ending about where there's no point in feeling nostalgic about your past era if your best is yet to come. If there is room for more brighter ideas in the future rather than constantly root itself in the past and show us if these films are worthy of our time beyond our own opinions. But doing things like Toy Story 5 again conflicts us and is not a worthwhile solution. It is agreed upon by everyone who knows that this movie is on the docket that doesn't do anything but continues something that doesn't need to exist, for something not greater that allowed Pixar to flourish in the past, where instead of capping off of certain ideas that could work, it is about capitalizing off of certain failures to rewrite the future of stability, which, thinking about this towards the end, is more of a reality of speaking about what we love for the better or for the worse, to realize points in time that need to be stressed out time and time again for the hope of a better tomorrow in terms of content of any type. And I shouldn't stop talking about it either if I feel the need to change is in the air, to generally be surprised if good can be done. Yes, these statements do not make sense and turn around for the worse when you become an executive, but I sure know that what he talks about is trying to feel what people want to feel the most. Yes, I know this feels like hopeless optimism compared to many of you who complain greatly about things like this is the final nail or death of the entire studio, but it is still here to talk about, and I won't actually admit that as long as we keep it in our minds to try to continue to pointlessly point this out, that this is more to inspire us to believe in the hope of the newer challenges to work out for the better. And we have to admit that the best days are yet to come if the past or the future is anything to say, or who can truly blame them for doing things like these when we ourselves made it so, that we need to start changing that conversation, whether it be in the box office by your wallet or whether you decide to make your own. And I'm all done, so goodbye.